Alan, there ought to be a rule that says you can only hold on to an interview for so long before you must release it.
I would be the first person to accept that rule, yes.
But this one, it's like we've known it's been there, and we've wanted to release it. And there's a million reasons why we just keep saying, well, just a little bit more. So, but this is it.
Yeah, I feel like the Lord is must be trying to teach me patience or something. Because this interview we're about to air today, and there's a video component as well to it that people will be able to access. An hour-long video just about. It's been there, uploaded on YouTube with an unlisted link for 5 years.
Yeah. And part of that, I think, is it shows the seriousness which with Rob, you, me, Alan, Wayne, everyone on the panel and everyone associated with the public square, how precious we take opportunities and how we really don't want to mess this stuff up. So several years ago, we had the opportunity, a unique opportunity that and we have had several now. I don't ever want to diminish any of them. If I stop and think about them, I start getting tearful. But we had the opportunity to go to Mount Vernon, to the home of George and Martha Washington. And we started at 4 a.m. on a private invitation. And we're met there by Dr. William B. Allen, who is, as you all know, one of our trustees. But before that, he was one of the people who in the late 80s wrote the definitive work on George Washington's letters and writings that is still for sale today. You got one right there in your hand.
Right here.
Right there it is. And that book is featured here at the American Mission Center in the William B. Allen Library. He met us there, and based on his goodwill with Mount Vernon and the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon and his many years of service there, we were granted access to tour the entire property with curators for 5 hours, from 4 a.m. until 9 a.m. And so we watched the sunrise on the Potomac from the front porch of George Washington's house.
Amazing.
And then we went through the process of storytelling and revealing facts and interviewing. And then we sat down with Dr. Allen and we just asked him a bunch of questions. And it's a beautiful piece in a beautiful setting. And he was perhaps at his very best.
He's in his element, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's able to speak about that, and you do hang on every word. I mean, there's certain people that you could listen, just read the phone book, and I think he's one of those people for me. Anytime he has something to say, I want to be listening and paying attention, and if not taking a physical note, taking a mental note, because you're gonna grow that day.
Well, just like David McCullough brought John Adams back to the general public through study of original source documents, Dr. William B. Allen has brought George Washington back and therefore inspired many other people to write. I had the privilege of writing the book first, The Leadership of George Washington, under Dr. Allen's mentorship. And so, which was incredibly exciting as a part of a master's thesis. And then he got involved, wrote the introduction to the book, and now he and I are actually involved in another writing project that's about to be released on John Quincy Adams, which is a book that David McCullough said in the year it was 1976. David McCullough said that's the next book that has to be written. Is the book on John Quincy Adams. So all of this is spiraled. So we wanted to get back to this interview. So just cast in your mind that we are at Mount Vernon, and it's just in the mid-morning. We're sitting in the beautiful facilities there, and William B. Allen, one of the world's greatest experts on George Washington, and truly a brilliant political philosopher, is going to talk to us about the first president. When you come to Mount Vernon, can you recall the first time that you came to this property?
Apart from the possibility of having come in 1972 when I was teaching at American University, the first time was probably my coming to the library here in the administration building to visit the library and begin conversations about opening the boardroom to a seminar. So I conducted a seminar on the presidency of George Washington here some 35 years ago or so. Mm. That would have been the beginning.
And can you capture how it felt the first time? Just like it feels now?
Well, yes, in a way, because I began with the very high privilege of having a private tour without the crowds and just the staff walking me through and talking very casually about it. So yes, it felt exceedingly special. I was treated specially, for one thing, but also I was able to settle down in the space without hubbub around, and therefore able to conceive almost as standing in the presence of George and Martha, because there was nothing else to distract from it. So yes, that was a very formative moment for me. I began the work on Washington without having spent any time at Mount Vernon and without being directly connected with Mount Vernon. I simply began by correspondence, writing not only to the library here, but libraries all across the country and indeed England as well, collecting materials just to put together my collection. So that by the time I got here, I was suffused with Washington. I got to know him, I think, in the best way possible to get to know not only Washington, but any historical figure, and that is by reading what he wrote in his own hand.
When did you feel in studying documents, because you studied how many?
I could not number them.
1,000?
More. Many more.
10,000.
Let us put it this way. I read everything I could get my hands on of the writings of George Washington. And those, of course, are many, many, many volumes. Orthography communicates an incredible depth of humanity. And when you are immersed in it, when you are deciphering manuscripts and making sense of them, you draw closer to the hand and the mind that moved the hand that produced the script. So I felt very close to Washington from that experience before I ever got to Mount Vernon. When I was here, therefore, I was able to take what I had already internalized and, as it were, embody it, at least imaginatively.
At some point, did he become predictable?
To be known is not necessarily to be predictable. I came to know him. I could not predict him in any sense other than having known something that he did at a particular moment in time. At an earlier moment, I could encounter something he did and see or anticipate what was going to come later because I already knew what came later. But was he predictable in any ordinary sense of the term? Only in the sense that you could depend on him.
For a man who spent so much time away from home, how is it that his marriage, his relationship with Martha, always seemed to be the most vital of all his relationships?
Well, you ask a very complicated question there, because if you think in terms of all the histories and biographies, you will realize the one thing people struggle with is trying to explain exactly the nature of his marriage, or let us put it in a more immediately relevant 21st century sense. People are confused about the character of Washington's erotic attachments and commitments. They're confused because of Sally Fairfax. One of the very most recent biographies, as far as I can tell, by McConnell, one that's just published, goes at great length imagining a consummation of a sexual encounter as the only way to explain that relationship, situating it across the spectrum of correspondences that are known to us. Utterly unnecessary, but it is a fine expression of 21st century sensibilities because we have such crabbed, such narrow expectations of ourselves. We can't imagine experiencing a passion and not acting on it. And therefore, we try to explain everybody in history as acting as we would act, not realizing that we're such smaller people than they were. So with Washington, you have to look at the broader picture before you ask the question of what was this relationship with Martha like, and understand that he was a man who consulted propriety early on and ever after. For him, a question of relationship wasn't a question merely of feeling. It was also a question of duty and obligation. Yes, sincere affection, extremely important, but sincere affection is not a substitute for propriety, for morality, for ethical conduct, for industry, for all of those aspects of culture that he brings to the table. So what happens in the relationship with Martha is nothing other than a playing out in the circle of intimacy of the consequences of a character well and strongly developed and able to be counted on. He didn't, in fact, one can almost say for certain, I would say, have a consummating experience with Sally Fairfax. It would make much more sense to say he had a conversation with Sally in which they understood one another and understood one another's obligations. It was a gentleman and a lady. And they could deal with passion and yet respond in prudent fashion and part and remain friends in the context. That is a much more natural explanation than imagining something lurid as the satisfaction of our own inclinations in the 21st century. Let me just take this a step further for you for a moment. So when I say all that as a prelude to saying he married Martha, I do not see that as a fallback, as people often tend to do. I see that as someone who's committed to domesticity, who begins from the early moments, even though he's attracted abroad and attracted to join the military, the Navy, the British Navy, or to go explore the West, to do many things looking beyond the narrow confines of Hunting Creek. He was nevertheless committed to domesticity. And that shows itself in so many ways. When he inherited Mount Vernon, which we look at now as a mansion, what he inherited was a modest cottage. And that was it. It was not a mansion. It became a mansion in his hands. And that very work of turning it into a mansion expresses his commitment to domesticity. Well, that commitment to domesticity begins with the commitment to Martha. That's where it achieves its first concrete expression, though it obviously was always present in him. So there, he's committing himself not just to a woman, but to a life. And the idea of a life with Martha was the inspiring conception. Having that, which they shared quite evidently, meant that they constructed a relationship of mutual confidence. They could completely trust in one another. And evidence of that was given in so many concrete fashions, it's impossible to resist it. Perhaps the most powerful evidence comes when they are receiving at Mount Vernon Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry, if I recall correctly, who were visiting and consulting with Washington before they went off to the First Continental Congress. And it is recorded that Martha addressed Henry and Lee there with the three of them seated and posed the tough question, "Are you gentlemen prepared to see this through to the end? I know George is, are you?" Which says, not only, of course, that she had perfect confidence in George and understood the events, but that he had perfect confidence in her. She could not have made that statement if they had not had sufficient and thorough conversation about the prospects they were facing, the consequences that were possible, the risks that they were taking. He took her fully into his confidence. And she responded with full confidence in him.
Dr. William B. Allen with Dave Zanotti at Mount Vernon. We'll be back for more of this conversation after this break.
Let's see, there's our tithe, food and clothing budget, taxes, all the insurance, and the car payments. Where's the line in your budget that helps pay the bill for fixing what's wrong in America? Log on today at aproundtable.org and join the growing team that's giving every month to get America back on track. Make your monthly contribution to aproundtable.org. Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
Welcome back to Mount Vernon and Dave Zanotti's on-location conversation with Dr. William B. Allen about George Washington. Here's Dave.
It's been noted that Washington did not have a great number of intimate, close friends. He sort of kept his own counsel. He was a friendly person. He had relationships with people that were long-term. But when you ask someone to list George Washington's 3 best friends, an honest historian sort of has to scratch his head, almost as if the relationship with Martha filled up so much space that along with the sense of work and duty in his own mind, he didn't need a whole lot of friends.
Oh, you pose a difficult question for me because I'm not sure I can buy that. I'm not sure what we really mean by deep friendships, certainly not in that era. If we ask, for example, about the friendship between Jefferson and Adams, it seemed at one level of friendship, correspondence suggests a friendly exchange of views, but there was not intimate reliance ever between them, ever. So what is a deep friendship? Was a deep friendship that of Madison and Jefferson, perhaps? That seems to stand the test. But as you canvass the founding, you find that degree of intimacy fairly rare among all of them. They had
Why would you say that is?
many friends. Washington had many friends. Certainly, many of the generals remained fast friends. Henry Knox we cannot call anything but a friend.
And Lafayette
to Washington.
was family.
Lafayette was virtual family. And I would say Alexander Hamilton was a dear friend, among others. So I don't know that I can accept that he didn't have close friends. I think what we demand of friendship has been infused with so much psychologism in the 20th and 21st centuries that we misrepresent it to ourselves. Having a close friend didn't mean that you reveal the most intimate aspects of your soul to the close friend. You didn't talk about your marriage necessarily, even with a close friend. If you did, that's fine. But we somehow make it a test of close friendship that you have no intimacy that you don't share with a friend. That was not characteristic of the late 18th century. So it seems to be that Washington had friends enough, but of course, Martha was his fastest companion.
She was difficult to describe in the sense that, as you mentioned, how dependable George Washington was and his sense of duty. She was right there.
Absolutely, absolutely. She dwelt in that relationship. And you can tell this because she had something, of course, that Washington didn't have directly. That is, she had produced children. And so she had commitments beyond the commitment to George Washington. And the children mattered to her. But there was never any tension that crept in there that suggested that Washington was kept at some remove from her other commitments. That was not the case. So the way she managed those commitments and managed them in the context of a complete commitment to George Washington is illustrative of the nature of the relationship that they had. I could illustrate it from the other side by saying, consider Washington's relationship with his mother. Martha never had an in-law problem because Mary was kept at a good distance. Frederick's is, in those times, a full day's journey from here, if not longer. And of course, Washington had, at best, a delicate relationship with his mother. She was a demanding person who demanded, of course, more than he could possibly give her in the way of attention and support. And he, on the other hand, insisted on pursuing his life and not being subject to those demands. So he even groused about them a little bit, to be sure. But the point is that he had someone on the other side of the relationship with Martha who didn't get in the way of the relationship with Martha. There was no mother-in-law problem at Mount Vernon.
Let's go to 1783 and the victorious general on the battlefield, writing the circular letter to the states, mapping out what he believes the design for the nation going forward needs to be for the new country, the union of the states, what he's learned from the war, what he's learned from the experiences of a failed Congress in many ways. But it's not a bitter letter. It's not a I told you so kind of note. It's not demanding. There appears to be nothing but a forthright calling toward what the future should look like. It's very hopeful. But he could have been bitter. Congress let him down over and over again, and yet he chose to be visionary.
I think it's fair to say that he never thought of himself in any position other than that of providing leadership. So the failures of Congress were not in that sense disappointments to him, because he carried the mantle of leadership himself throughout the course of the entire struggle. And there, at the end of the war, the conclusion of the peace, how does he describe that circular letter? He says, "This is my political legacy." Very self-conscious. He understood he was giving direction, so that he was doing more than trying to repair the breaches of a broken Congress. He was trying to build a nation. This is something that isn't sufficiently appreciated, that in these moments, he's reaching beyond the mere confines of the institutions that exist and setting his roots deep into the hearts and soul of the people.
Do you think that circular letter surprised others in political leadership in the sense that he was making a bold statement? It was a powerful tool. It was sent to the newspapers. It was sent to the governors of the states. At that time, some of them were called presidents, I believe.
Yes.
We think they were surprised that this came from Washington?
I do not think so. I know this. I don't find anywhere in the record expressions of surprise. What I find instead is the period starting in 1783 when it was issued, through the period of the Constitutional Convention, and up through, therefore, 1788, the ratification debate. And for a time, at the time of his farewell address, it was constantly reprinted and read. I.e., it was received by the people gratefully. So far from being surprised by it, I think what it expressed was what they had already come to expect of George Washington. Affirmative, assertive, aggressive leadership.
How did he put the pieces together from the Declaration to the circular letter to the states, which in a way becomes an initial outline for a constitutional form of government? He was fighting a war. He was a busy fella for those 8 years. How did he progress in that thinking? Because among the founders and framers, he's not in modern times considered to be the massive intellect of the group.
Yeah, that's so funny, isn't it? It's true, of course. It's hard to find a scholar who gives him full credit for his intelligence. But is it actually so odd that people miss the point of what real understanding and leadership is about? It wouldn't be necessary if people ordinarily rose to the standards fulfilled by such leadership. They wouldn't need founders if they could found themselves. They wouldn't require inspiration if they could inspire themselves. So that, yes, Washington was exceptional. Washington possessed and offered what no one else in the founding possessed and offered. And we know this because it doesn't just start with the Declaration. Remember, he essentially declares independence when he's appointed commander of the Army of the United States. He himself declares it in his first general orders. You are now soldiers not of Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. You are soldiers of the United Provinces of North America. He's declaring an independent country into existence a year before the Declaration of Independence does so. Prior to that, for 2 years or more, he didn't just show up at the Second Continental Congress in uniform and therefore get to be elected general as a kind of accident of circumstance. He spent 2 years preparing people for military exertion. He was the first person in the country to speak of taking up arms, of fighting for liberty, the very first person. He's the person who said early on, I will personally pay for a militia and train and arm them as we prepare for this, long before the outbreak of hostilities. In short, Washington laid out markers all along the way for a transition from dependence on Great Britain to independence and liberty, so that by the time we start declaring these things officially, we're only actually fulfilling the promise that Washington had already given.
That's Dr. W.B. Allen in conversation with Dave Zanotti at Mount Vernon. We'll be back for more of The Public Square after a break. You're listening to The Public Square on location from George Washington's Mount Vernon. Here's Dave Zanotti and Dr. William B. Allen.
That's what Lafayette called Washington.
Yeah.
He called him a missionary of liberty.
Well, is it not a fair appreciation of George Washington if one follows the course of all that he had to say and do during the war? He was not just a functionary. There was no country, there was no army. This was created from scratch. Yes, of course he had a military background. Yes, of course he was ambitious. Yes, of course he prepared himself for these things. But it is not, therefore, to be concluded that he was doing it for nothing other than self-aggrandizement. He was doing it for the very reasons he expressed to his wife's uncle before it all turned sour back in 1764. That you are threatening the destruction of our liberties. And that means a lot to us. He was speaking that way before it had become a crisis. And he spoke more urgently about it. He played the key role in launching the boycotting of British imports, of the associations, the sanctions, as we would call them today, against trade with Britain. Early in the revolutionary process, he, with George Mason, developed the Fairfax Resolves that led to the first substantial economic retaliation against the British. And this was early, before the worst aspects. No Boston Massacre had occurred yet.
No Lexington Green.
No Lexington Green. Mm-hmm. So he's leading the way, and throughout, he's constantly talking about it as a case of freedom versus slavery, liberty or slavery. So that he might be called a missionary for liberty is not at all out of sync with what he had done. And then when Lafayette gets there and joins the military, what do you think their conversations are about? The same conversations he was having with Alexander Hamilton, with Lawrence, with Reed, and with others. And if you follow any of their works or records that are left, you can see they are too filled with this language of liberty. This was what people talked to Washington about because this is what Washington was talking about.
Yet Washington did not subscribe to the formulations of the French Revolution. His view was different.
Well, what he did was react with caution. And he advised Lafayette, he says, look, it's not clear exactly what you're doing over there. I wish you well. And I hope, too, that you can come to know the life of liberty as we have entered into it here. But some of the things you're doing seem highly questionable in that regard because there's not due regard for order, for the rule of law. That's what frightened him from the beginning and became more alarming through the progress of that French Revolution. And of course, the fact that it ultimately led to Lafayette's own suffering, endangerment first in France and then finally imprisonment in Austria, only vindicated Washington's hesitations. So yes, he wanted to encourage France's movement in the direction of liberty, but he didn't think they were moving there in the prudent manner necessary to secure it. Just as in the 1783 circular address, he was clear to the Americans that they were at a very dangerous point.
How so?
A point at which they had to assume responsibility for themselves, but they couldn't exercise that responsibility imprudently, that to do so would lose everything. They were claiming liberty, but they now had to recognize that liberty required something of them, something that he called a national character. So that they had to be fit for liberty in order to profit from liberty. So liberty was not a self-fulfilling good. It was a conditional good. It was an opportunity to be good.
What was the next step? What did it require?
He was in that sense a missionary for liberty. The next step was taking into one's self-awareness, one's consciousness, the obligation and responsibility to build a character that could sustain liberty in decency. The way I prefer to express it these days is to say Washington made clear that what would be necessary would be people who would practice forbearance and justice and also would practice fortitude in industry. And that if they didn't build this liberty on that structure, the liberty itself would become destructive and not productive. It would not be a progressive amelioration of the human condition, but a worsening of the human condition. So liberty has a precondition: fortitude and industry, forbearance and justice, fundamental virtues.
Now, this from a philosopher, a political philosopher. I just thought that they went from the Declaration to the Constitution and maybe got a little lucky on the way because they avoided all those counter-revolutions because they got so busy building the new country.
It's surprising you say that. You can often find historians who say Washington was lucky. He was lucky in the war. Things fell out his way. He wasn't a good general. He didn't actually plan it. They completely ignore the extraordinary energy he devoted to riding this Bronco. And he knew it was a Bronco. From the moment he appeared in Boston before those troops and looked at them with disgust. What a ragtag bunch this is. He knew he was riding a Bronco. But he exerted himself for 8 long years to tame the Bronco, to bring it under rein and give it direction. And that was his purpose. It wasn't luck at all. It was moral strength, resolve, and understanding that produced the outcome.
He said to the German congregation in a letter in New York, I believe they were,
Yes.
that his motivation was civil and religious liberty.
What induced me to take the field was civil and religious liberty. That was what he said. Yes.
And I found that Lincoln used the same term
Yes.
in the Lyceum Address.
Yes.
Do you think Lincoln read that letter?
I don't know that he had to. I think he read Washington. That much is clear. And he could have read that letter. But he could have derived the same principle for any of a number of the works of Washington. And the sheer example of Washington. Indeed, he could have gotten it even just from the farewell address. The point is, Washington made clear at every instance that it was civil and religious liberty that constituted the foundation. It was the right of conscience, the freedom of conscience, that created the foundation of this republic. The whole purpose for establishing it was to secure the authority of the freedom of conscience. That's what civil and religious liberty meant to George Washington. And it is no accident that that is, of course, consistent with the last of the 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation, which is keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. This is all a single story, not a series of separate stories in George Washington.
He was very consistent about wanting to get home, very consistent about being home for Christmas, 1783.
Yes.
The man is remarkably intentional. He meets with his friends, the generals, his commanding officers that are with him at the tavern in New York.
Yes.
They release one another back to civilian life with tears. What a meeting that would have been.
Yes.
Then he heads to Annapolis. And I find it fascinating that Congress was a little edgy when he showed up. I understand there was a meeting for protocol on how they would go about permitting him to return his commission to Congress. Do you think they were a little bit anxious about his next move?
Yes. Oh, anxious. Let me say this. You say anxious. I don't want by anxious to communicate fearful. I don't know that they were afraid of George Washington. They had good reason to trust George Washington. Washington had stilled the Newburgh conspiracy. and had given them powerful demonstration of his loyalty and dedication. But they were no less sensitive to the fact that things were in turmoil, and they weren't certain what steps should follow next. And they knew his extraordinary influence and authority.
Is it possible that if he had presented a report card on their performance, it could have made them look quite bad?
Or is it possible that he could have said, look, enough of this, let's reorganize here and now. I'm not going to go away, I'm going to stay until we get it sorted out. They couldn't be sure about that part of it.
He had a number of plays to make.
And so they could anticipate with some uneasiness, what is George Washington going to do? He's the only person in the country who's universally recognized.
And as a political philosopher, you have studied the governments of humanity. Has there been a time similar to this where the commanding victorious general left the field to go home?
Cincinnatus, of course, and it is always said that he was embracing the example of Cincinnatus in Rome to lay down his weapons and return to his farm. And that may be. He doubtlessly knew the story. He may or may not have known the advice of Machiavelli, which is to say a successful general must do one of two things, either seize command or resign command and win reputation. He may have done it for any number of reasons, or it may be that this is simply who he was. This was his soul.
I vote for that one. And can I submit my evidence?
Yes.
Obviously, his actions of surrendering his commission, handing the speech, I understand the committee, I don't have all the records yet for personal review, but the summaries say that the committee was hoping he would bow to Congress on his way out, that in essence, he did recognize they were the source of the authority, not the military. But the biggest thing of all was he went home.
Well, it is true enough that, of course, he was always referred to as His Excellency when he was commander. That was the title that was used, typically, of George Washington. And that might raise questions in people's minds about exactly what his status was or what he himself thought of that status. So, yes, they might think, we have to establish some authority here. This is brand new, and we no longer have the monarchical authority of Britain in place or the aristocratic hierarchies. How are we supposed to deal with one another? We saw this surface even as late as 1789 when the new government was instituted, and John Adams led this silly debate in the Senate about how to address the president. Well,
it's incredibly transparent, wasn't it?
Yes.
What do we call this guy?
Yeah, exactly. So that it would have happened in 1783 is no surprise. Mm-hmm. But Washington never exacted any form of deference in that regard. And he always did something far more important, not just in 1783 at the resignation, but throughout the course of the war. He always reinforced civilian authority. And you've got to remember, he was the one who was experiencing the dreadful consequences of the failure of civilian authority, and yet he constantly reinforced it.
He lost men. There were people who died.
Because of failures of civilian authority.
Failure to provide resources and funding and necessities. He, as this missionary of liberty.
Or just to reply promptly.
He watched his friends, people he respected greatly, forfeit their lives.
He could have easily have considered the people who, whether they were in Philadelphia or Trenton or wherever they were hiding at this particular point in time, he could have considered them a swamp. But he didn't. He reinforced civilian authority.
Martha's son died
Yes.
in the camp.
Yes.
1781.
Yes.
Battle of Yorktown.
Yes.
The end of the war.
Yes.
She lost her only surviving son.
That's right.
He could have been very bitter about that.
Which provided the occasion, the one of only 2 nights he spent at Mount Vernon was on the occasion, of course, of Jackie's death and returning with Jackie.
And he died of camp fever. He didn't die of a bullet wound.
Right.
Maybe if Congress had done their job a little better, Jackie would have lived.
Oh, maybe, but certainly we may dwell on that, but you would never expect Martha or George to dwell on that. I mean, the chances of life, it's no different than losing poor Patsy to epilepsy. These are the chances of life. And these are people who didn't become defeated by the chances of life.
They didn't look for a lawyer?
No. They were not victims. They didn't know what it meant to be a victim. They were determined not to be victims. That's why you would take the kind of risk that they took.
He was always fighting to get home.
Yes.
So, 1783, he goes home for Christmas.
Yes.
To keep a promise?
In a way, I mean, he did promise. The war was over. He had been a long time away. But I think there's a more important dimension to that than the promise. We can't forget. I mean, we can sit in the middle of July, the hottest time of the year, much like it was before he went off to the First Continental Congress, I suppose, when he and Martha spoke to Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry. But we must remember that when he did go off in the middle of the summer to start waging war, for the next 8 years, at least the next 6 of them, through the end of the war, Martha went to him virtually every winter. She strapped on her petticoat, a stout dress, and a heavy wrap, and got in a carriage in the terrible weather of winter and went to him for Christmas, after Christmas, after Christmas. So by the time 1783 comes, and he comes home for Christmas, that's saying, Martha, you don't have to come this year.
The mansion was filled at its core with guests, often not necessarily invited people who came and spent time here, and the Washingtons went along with that.
Well, Martha did sometimes speak of running a public hostel, not necessarily approvingly, but nevertheless.
They entertained hundreds
Yes.
and hundreds of people here on a regular basis.
Perfect strangers felt free to come to Mount Vernon once Washington had become, of course, General Washington, President Washington. Perfect strangers would stop in and receive hospitality.
Well, along that line, then, he comes home for Christmas, but he doesn't get to stay very long. He's back to the Constitutional Convention. He's back home again, but he doesn't get to stay very long. He's taken up to become the President of the United States. And yet, the first president, POTUS #1, a man whose legend is in every footstep. He's known around Mount Vernon as General Washington, not President Washington. Everyone talks about the general.
That's correct.
Did they forget he was the first president?
No. When he became General Washington, that represented the consummation of ambition. Everything else was service.
Let's talk about his passing. The tremendous irony that some people have attempted from the beginning to say that every Virginian was in it for the treasure, for the bucks and for the money. And,
Yes.
Look at that big mansion and all of that stuff, and look at all those acres, and look at all those slaves. It was all about the Benjamins.
Well, you must understand, in the 21st century, the spirit of envy is alive in the land. And therefore, it leads people to attribute false motives to their predecessors. It has nothing to do with the truth. It is a looking back that is looking backwards. It means, of course, that we don't understand people who are genuinely humane, who take seriously the necessity to lead ethical lives, which includes being productive, includes producing as far as possible prosperous conditions, materially and politically, and who see all that as a moral responsibility and not a mere expression of acquisitiveness. So when we reduce it to explanations of acquisitiveness, we're actually describing ourselves, not our ancestors. The people who give you those accounts are telling you that's all they know how to do. But they aren't describing George Washington.
Or Martha.
Or Martha. Or even the era, which is not to say that greed isn't always present throughout all of human history in some souls. But greed does not define being human.
That's Dr. Allen on location at Mount Vernon. We've got to take a break, and if your station has to leave us now, hear the rest of this conversation at thepublicsquare.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. For everyone else, we'll be right back, right here. Welcome back to our final few minutes with Dr. Allen and Dave Zanotti from Mount Vernon as they turn their attention to George Washington's will.
So he chose to release his slaves in his will upon his passing. Martha shortly thereafter did the same. He's sending a message to the nation. POTUS number 1, the general, the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. Was that simply exhaustion? He knew that the model couldn't work any longer, that it was simply time to let it go, and no better time than now. Was it simply moral revulsion? Was it a simple attempt to try to earn his way to heaven? It was intentional. Can we discern the intent?
Well, slaves were set free and provided for in the main. And that was the expression of a purpose, of an intention. I don't think it was exhaustion or weariness, though we certainly find him expressing a degree of exhaustion with the topic in Letters to Lafayette in particular, when he makes clear that he is beginning to despair that anything is ever going to be done to relieve the country of this incubus. So he does reach that stage.
What is an incubus?
What is an incubus? Devil, demon. And being infested by an alien growth or spirit.
That's slavery.
That's what we mean by, that's what he thought of slavery as.
Demonic.
Yes, that's what he thought at the end. So he expresses some weariness, some frustration that he cannot see that this is going to be resolved. He had supported the move for abolition in the Virginia House, and it got nowhere, and that disappointed him greatly. But I don't believe the will is an expression of frustration. I believe the will is just a last effort to communicate to his countrymen the standard that he wished them to live by. Understanding that he is not trying to rule by command, which, remember, outside of the military, even throughout the administration, he avoids this ruling by command. What he does is invite people to rule themselves. And so the will is a last invitation for people to take the responsibility of self-rule with sufficient seriousness that they will see that it cannot be compatible with maintaining slavery. Look, the will doesn't just free the slaves, but it gives a public address to the country about the question of education, doesn't it?
It does
morality,
indeed.
Which means he sees the whole document as a public document. Now, he knows it's going to be recorded at the county court, the county seat in Alexandria, but he knows also that George Washington's will is going to be read by everyone. He knows this.
He writes it in his own hand.
Of course.
Even
yes.
Annotating,
yes.
Underlining, excessive capitalization.
Yes.
Long before the internet. He's very demonstrative in that document.
Yes. Or one might say very articulate. Washington speaks it into the nation's heart, and then it's up to the nation to receive it. And we see the nation beginning to receive it only 30 years after his death. And then, of course, it progresses to the point of the ultimate crisis. That's the way to think about what he's doing, not whether he, through fiat, changed the institution, but whether he, through insemination, changes the nation. Washington spoke in that circular address in 1783 of the fate of unborn millions. He says, that's why we're doing this, which meant he wasn't talking about his generation. They were a comparative handful in that respect. This was the usual discourse of the era. We're looking towards unborn posterity. Well, people who can anticipate a distant future, a distant posterity, begin, of course, with regard for the proximate, for the human beings here and now, and for those who came before. So that to extend one's thinking remotely, whether into the past or into the future, begins with the center on one's obligations in the present. And the whole idea of trying to strip ourselves of reflection backwards is only a way of hobbling ourselves from understanding our relationship not only to the past but to the future, and therefore doing violence to ourselves with regard to exactly who we are, where do we stand, and what are our options, what are our opportunities in the present.
I'm endlessly learning about this place and about the life of Washington. I often stop in studies and ask myself more of a comic book question. Who is this guy?
Who is this George Washington?
And who is this Martha Washington? Who are these people? The richness, the wonder. And I found that manifested in this property in doing a little bit more research and talking to the folks here to discover that this property in Northern Virginia was neutral territory during the Civil War.
That is to say, not appropriated by either side to the purposes of the war.
Nor attacked by either side to gain advantage.
That's what I mean, yes. That's what I mean, precisely.
Now, the Union Army didn't think twice about taking the Lee Mansion on top of the hill in Arlington.
Correct.
But not this place. Even though the Lee Mansion goes back into the Washington family, but this place, now this is sentimentality on my part, so I apologize. I'll never be that kind of historian. Mm-hmm. But to me, they wouldn't touch a blade of grass on this place.
Well, you got to remember, in a way, that's what the war was about, in a purely metaphorical or symbolic sense. The war was about who would, in the end, lay claim to the founders as inspiration. Would it be a slave society or a free society?
Well, again, you just learn so much every time we hear Dr. Allen speak. And I remember when you guys got back from this trip, you told a story that is stuck with me, because there's some places that people go that you're instantly recognized, or people hear your voice and they say, well, wait a minute, are you? And you guys got to experience that with Dr. Allen, did you not?
You know, it was 105 degrees that day. Remember, Allen?
It was a hot one.
It was
I'm glad
brutal.
maybe that's why they made us start so early in the morning.
Oh, it was brutal. And Dr. Allen wore his visit to Mount Vernon suit. He has a suit that's the same color as the general's flag, the blue in the flag.
Oh, okay.
And that's one of the reasons we have the general's commander-in-chief flag portrayed at the William B. Allen Library. So he wore his GW suit and his bow tie and his suspenders. And he never took that suit off until lunch. He took the jacket off. Didn't loosen his tie, but he took the jacket off. And so we're sitting there at lunch, and it's now noon, and there's like a group of people who are part of the character portrayal reenactors at the general's home. They call him the general. That's how he was referred to in Mount Vernon always. Not Mr. President. He was always the general. And they sort of gathered, a handful of them gathered just past where our table was, and I started watching them get on their phones and look and talk and poke each other. And finally, one of them had the courage to walk up and say, excuse me, are you W.B. Allen? And he said, well, yes, I am. Would you like to sit down and join us? And all of a sudden, the whole group shows up at the table. Everything is disrupted in the restaurant. And Dr. Allen has the privilege of conducting a seminar with this group of people that was extraordinary. And it made me feel really good about America, because there's still a passion to learn where we came from and why. And I think that Dr. Allen is the specialist in that, so he's a great gift to all of us.
Yes, he is. Thanks, Dave, Rob, and Dr. Allen. And thank you for listening to The Public Square. Before we go, I wanted to say that in producing this conversation for radio, we had to leave some fascinating footage on the cutting room floor, including a very special moment with Dave and Dr. Allen at George Washington's tomb. Please visit us at TPS In Studio on YouTube to watch the video version of this conversation and to share it with a friend. We'll see you next time on The Public Square.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.